So this is the story of the woman caught in adultery that we see. The first part of it is in John 7:53. It doesn't really it doesn't really tell anything about the story, but then it goes to 8:11. And the reason why it starts at John 7:53 isn't because this has something to do with the story. It's because that that portion is part of um, the belief that this story wasn't original uh, in John, and we're going to talk about all of that. Okay, so that's why you see. We'll open up your books to John 7:53 to 11, and then tell me what your Bible says above that. It starts at John 7:53 and it goes to John 8:11. Anybody got it open to their Bible? What does it say? Does it say something above it?
Oh,
above it? In your Bible. In your Bible.
Oh,
do not include 7.
The earliest manuscripts does not contain John 7:53 to John 8:11. Curious. And the truth is, that's because it wasn't in there. So we're going to talk about all of that, but first we have to learn a couple of terms. We're going to talk about authenticity and veracity. Anybody? I think you've probably heard the term authenticity, right? Something is authentic, something that is authentic. Veracity has to do with truthfulness. So veracity means the truthfulness. Is this a real story? One person here will remember this. When I'm storyteller Amy every June, early in June, this will be my 20th year, I'm storyteller Amy. And whenever I teach from the Bible, a story from the Bible, I ask the campers, so this story is in the Bible. Is it a true story or a pretend story? And they all say, it's a true story. And so, yeah, it is. So is this a true story? And so then when we're talking about veracity, that's what we mean. Authenticity means that this story was written by John at the same time as the rest of the gospel. So we have reasons for questioning the authenticity, and nearly all scholars, even evangelical ones, would say that this story is not authentic. In other words, it wasn't in John when John wrote it. John didn't write it, and it wasn't in John's gospel until later. So but that's not talking about truthfulness. That's just talking about, was this originally in John? So the reason I say that, and I've already alluded to this, the earliest manuscripts omit it. It's not there. The earliest copies of the Gospel of John, it's not in there anywhere. And then the earliest commentaries. So commentaries are books that explain the Bible, explain different books and different passages. These are all commentaries of different books of the Bible. And I've got more over there, and I took a bunch of them home because my husband wants to study Revelation. So I took some of them home. But and they explain, what does this mean? What does this say? What does this mean? And how can we apply it to our lives? And so there are very ancient commentaries on everything in the Bible, and those earliest commentaries don't have this story in them. And then when it starts showing up in the Bible, it shows up in different locations, locations in John, and sometimes it shows up in Luke. So and in each of those cases, it breaks up the flow of the narrative, especially in John. Um, if we look at um, this, so you see 753, they each went to their own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. So so they walked away, right? And they were done. And now all of a sudden, he's in the temple again. So uh, so and the style that it breaks up the flow of the narrative, and and the language and the grammar are different. There are a number of words found in this story that are not found anywhere else in John's writings. Uh, but they are found. Those words and those ideas show up in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the style of this story is much more like what the stories in the Synoptic Gospels. It doesn't read like uh, a story that John would write. So but is it a true story? So what I want to tell you is, so now we're talking about veracity, truthfulness. It's a very early story. In fact, the church's first historian, his name was Eusebius, learned the story from Papias, who was a father of the church. Papias lived during the time of the gospel writers. So Papias was around when John was around. And so uh, the story then is just as old as the stories in the Gospels. And it's very typical of those stories we find in the Synoptic Gospels. So this story, I believe, is just as old as the stories in the Gospels. And it's very typical of the types of stories we see elsewhere. So why was it left out for a while? If it's as old as the stories we read in the New Testament, why didn't they put it in there? I think there's a pretty easy answer to that. I believe it was left out of the canon, out of the Bible, because of the nature of the story. Jesus is showing mercy to a woman caught in adultery, in sin, sexual sin. Such a thing would have been unheard of in the church of the first, second, third, fourth centuries. Those women would have been stoned, and the men would have been as well. So it's a little bit unseemly, especially for the time that it was written. And so it probably made the church leaders uncomfortable to put that into the Bible. So I'm just going to sum up a little bit here on everything I've just said. So I believe this is a true story that somehow got misplaced in John. I also believe that we can learn much from this story. And we will therefore study and apply it just as we have the other true stories in John's gospel. So we're going to start with we. I haven't read the whole thing, right? I haven't read the whole thing, right? So I'm going to read the whole thing and then we'll go back through it. So starting at John 7:53. They each went to their own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst of all these people, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" This they said to test him, that they might have a charge to bring against him. So they brought this woman to Jesus not because they're concerned about justice. They're concerned about tripping up Jesus so that they can arrest him. That's the whole purpose of bringing this woman to him. And as they continued to ask him, meaning Jesus, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." So that's the passage. Um, and and so um, here's what, because this is a trap, but I want to explain to you some things about the legality of this. So it says that she was caught in the very act. And the very act of adultery. So that was a legal claim because that was unlawful. Adultery was unlawful. So, so then if they were bringing that charge, and they were bringing that charge, and they were expecting Jesus to either forgive her or say, yes, she should be tried for adultery. Either way, he'd be in trouble. If he lets her off, well, then he's a lawbreaker. If he says, yeah, stone her, then he's not being compassionate on her, and he's supposed to be compassionate. So so this is a legal claim, and so this is what was needed to adjudicate this. There had to be at least two witnesses who saw the actual act at the same time and place, but did not participate in it. For this to be true in this case, they would have had to set a trap for this. And I believe they did. They didn't happen upon this act. They set it up. Reminds me from years ago when we were living in Europe, and I was your age. I was in 10th grade, and my dad was on a trip for NATO, and he wanted to see a church that was called our Our Lady in the Attic. ATTIC. You see, there was a time, I think in the 1400s, 1500s, sometime around there, when those who were Catholic, who were members of the Catholic Church, were out. That was outlawed, and so they were being persecuted, and they couldn't openly worship. So they lived in these row houses that were all connected together. And they went into the attic of those row houses and they tore down the walls between them and they created a church in the attic. And it's a beautiful church. And when my whole family went, we saw that. By the way, as an aside, anybody remember or read Anne Frank's diary? I went there too. I went to her house. And I wept my way through it. And it was a 15, 16-year-old, very standoffish and rebellious girl that hit me because she was my age when the Nazis. So my dad is looking for Our Lady in the attic, and he ends up in the red light district. Anybody know what the red light district is? It's where you get the drugs. It's where you get the prostitutes. It's the bad part of town, and he was there. And one of his colleagues, also a member of the NATO military committee, probably also a general, said, "Marty, what are you doing here?" And my dad said, honestly, "I'm looking for a church." And he laughed at him. "Yeah, right. You're looking at a church." And this is what this is. This is the red light district. She's a prostitute, um, and and she's been caught in adultery. So, but I do believe that they were setting her up. It was they wanted to use her for their own power play against Jesus. They cared nothing about justice. And can I just say, especially you ladies, where's the guy? Is the guy in trouble? Or is it just the girl? As D.A. Carson, one of my favorite scholars, says, uh, adultery is not a sin that one commits in splendid isolation. But the man, particularly in a sexist society, is not their concern. They could have brought her to Jesus privately, but they don't. They present her to Jesus in a crowd, uh, and if they did that privately, it wouldn't have fit their agenda because they wanted everyone to deny Jesus, and they thought this would do that. And Jesus knows exactly what they're doing. They're trying to trap him. Because if he refuses to uphold the Mosaic law, he's a lawbreaker, and they can charge him with that. But if he upholds the Mosaic law, not only would he be essentially signing that woman's death warrant, but he would have supported a practice of stoning that was not very popular at the time. Either way, his popularity and his ministry would suffer. So either way, they believed they had him. They had him trapped. Or did they? So we're going to stop there, and we'll pick up here tomorrow. So all the classes are in the same place, and you can chat.